The dust of Garnet Bend settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the soul. It clung to the sweat on Rowan Pike's neck as he swung down from his horse. The animal's flanks dark with the long ride from the stockyards. The sun had been a hammer on his back for 3 days, and the silence of the high desert still rang in his ears. He moved with the stiff grace of a man who spent more time with sheep than with people, his shoulders set in a permanent brace against the world. He pushed through the bat-wing doors of Sparrow's Rest, the only saloon in a town that felt more like a temporary argument with the landscape than a permanent settlement. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and the coming rain. It was a smell of weary men and cheap whiskey. He walked to the bar, his spurs making no sound on the packed earth floor, and laid his leather riding gloves on the scarred wood. The gesture was a ritual, a shedding of the trail. They were dark with use. The fingers curved from years of gripping reins, and they carried the faint, honest scent of lanolin from his flock. "Whiskey," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding in a dry creek bed. Mabel Key, the woman who owned the saloon and knew the town's secrets better than the preacher knew his psalms, slid a glass toward him without a word. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, flickered to the corner of the room before returning to his. He didn't need to follow her gaze. He could feel the weight of their stares. 3 of them, Bishop Crow's men. They sat hunched over a table, their hands never far from the pistols at their hips. They weren't drinking so much as they were occupying space, staking a claim on the very air in the room. They were Crow's shadow, and it was a long one. Just then, the clatter of the weekly mail coach broke the tense quiet. It groaned to a halt outside, the driver shouting curses at his tired horses. The saloon door swung open again, letting in a swirl of dust and a woman. She stood blinking in the gloom, a stark contrast to the hard-faced men and the dim interior. She was not a woman of the territory. That was plain to see. Her dress, though simple and dark, was cut from a cloth not meant for this kind of grit. She clutched a wooden box to her chest as if it were a shield. It was a humble thing, polished by time and care, its corners worn smooth. Through the dust, Rowan could see it held books, the faded gold lettering on their spines hinting at poetry and grammar, worlds away from Garnet Bend. Her name was June Ellery, though no one in the room knew it yet, and she had come west on the promise of a temporary teaching position, a chance to outrun a life that no longer fit. The silence that greeted her was different from the one that had met Rowan. His had been a silence of wary respect and old tension. Hers was one of pure curiosity, the collective stare of a town assessing a foreign object. The air grew heavier, charged with the ozone of an approaching storm. One of Crow's men, a lean, sharp-faced man they called Silk Danner, leaned back in his chair, the legs scraping against the floor. His eyes, cold and flat as a snake's, slid over Rowan and then lingered on the newcomer. It was a look of casual ownership, the kind of look that assessed everything in town as belonging, one way or another, to his boss. Rowan's gaze drifted past them, to a piece of paper nailed crookedly to the wall. It was a public notice. The ink still fresh, it declared in stark, official letters that Dry Willow Creek was to be resurveyed by order of the territorial magistrate. Below the formal language, the true meaning was clear to every soul in Garnet Bend. Water was more than life here. It was power. The creek was the artery that kept the small ranches and homesteads alive, including Rowan's Bishop Crow, whose vast cattle operation already drank greedily from the land, wanted to own the artery itself. A resurvey, overseen by a man on Crow's payroll, was just a legal-looking way to hold a knife to the town's throat. June Ellery finally found her voice. It was clearer and softer than any sound the saloon was used to. "Excuse me," she said to the room at large. "Could someone please direct me to the schoolhouse?" A nervous shuffle went through the few patrons at the bar. A man staring into his beer suddenly found the bottom of his glass immensely interesting. Another wiped the counter with a rag that was already clean. No one spoke. No one met her eye. Mabel Key finally broke the silence, her voice low and practical. "There ain't much of a schoolhouse, ma'am, just an old storage barn, and it's out past the bend." She wiped a glass, her movements deliberate. On the edge of the Pike Hollow Graze lands. She didn't need to say more. The school wasn't just a building. It was a location. It sat on the fringe of the very land Crow was squeezing, a stone's throw from the disputed access to Dry Willow Creek. To associate with the school was to choose a side. And in Garnet Bend, choosing a side against Bishop Crow was a good way to find your well gone dry or your fences cut. June's expression tightened with a confusion that was slowly hardening into resolve. She had not traveled 1,000 miles to be defeated by a silent room. She looked from one averted face to another, her gaze finally landing on Rowan. He was the only one not actively avoiding her eyes. He was simply watching, his face an unreadable mask of dust and stoicism. The wind howled outside, a prelude to the storm's full fury. It rattled the windows and threw a handful of grit against the door. June took a step back, preparing to face the elements alone. Without a word, Rowan picked up his glass, downed the whiskey in a single, smooth motion, and placed it back on the bar. He walked past her toward the door, his steps measured and sure. As he passed, he unslung the heavy wool greatcoat from his shoulder. It was a rugged, functional garment, smelling of sagebrush and cold nights. He held it out to her. His eyes said nothing, offered nothing, but the gesture was plain. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. The weight of the wool was surprising, a solid, reassuring presence. She wrapped it around her shoulders as he pushed the doors open and stepped out onto the saloon's covered porch. At that exact moment, a single, sharp crack echoed from the low hills to the east, where Crow's ranch sprawled across the valley. It wasn't the sound of hunting. It was a single, deliberate rifle shot, a punctuation mark at the end of an unspoken threat, a reminder of who held the high ground. June followed Rowan onto the porch, pulling the coat tighter. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face. The sky had turned a bruised purple, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. She looked at Rowan's broad back as he stared out into the gathering gloom. His stillness was unnerving. It wasn't passive. It was rooted, like a desert juniper that had weathered 100 storms. She had to raise her voice to be heard over the rising wind. "If everyone is so afraid," she called out, her words a challenge to him, to the town, to the gunshot that still hung in the air. Then where are the children supposed to learn? For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in him. He turned his head slightly, and in the strange, stormy light, his eyes seemed to lose some of their hardness. It wasn't warmth. Not yet, but it was a crack in the stone, a recognition of a question that had an answer he couldn't, or wouldn't, ignore. He saw in her not the fragility he had first assumed, but a spine made of something tougher than steel. Then the heavens opened. The rain didn't start. It attacked, falling in a solid, blinding sheet. It hammered on the tin roof of the porch and turned the dust of the street into a thick, running mud. The deluge drove them closer together, forcing them to huddle back against the saloon wall to escape the spray. The world shrank to the small, dry space of the porch, the roar of the storm erasing everything else. They stood so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the sudden chill of the air. The space between them was no more than a held breath. He smelled of the rain, of wet wool, and something else, something wild and clean, like the desert after a storm. For a long moment, they just stood there. Two strangers thrown together by a tempest, both literal and of men's making. Rowan looked away from her, his gaze settling on an old rain barrel at the edge of the porch. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took his leather gloves from where they were tucked in his belt. He laid them carefully on the damp lid of the barrel, the dark leather stark against the wood. The gesture was quiet, almost imperceptible against the chaos of the storm. But it was a decision made manifest. It was the same as a spoken oath. It was his answer. Tomorrow, he would take her to the school. The dawn at Pike Hollow was a quiet thing, a slow bleeding of gray into the black sky above the mesas. Mist clung to the low places, muffling the world in a damp shroud. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic chewing of the sheep in their enclosure and the occasional choked clank of a bell. A lonely sound in the vast silence. This was Rowan Pike's world, built not of wood and nail but of dry stacked stone fences that snaked across the land like ancient vertebrae. His father and grandfather had laid them, stone by patient stone, and Rowan maintained them. They were his inheritance, his boundary against the wildness of the territory and the greed of men like Bishop Crow. Inside the small, sturdy cabin that smelled of pine smoke and coffee, Rowan sat at a rough-hewn table. The first light slanted through a single clean window, illuminating the document spread before him. It was the original water rights grant for his section of Dry Willow Creek, signed and sealed by a territorial governor long since dead. The paper was brittle, the folds worn thin as a moth's wing. The wax seal was a cracked, faded rose of a color that had once been defiant red. His father's signature was a confident scrawl at the bottom. His own name was not on it, but his duty was. He traced the legalistic script with a calloused finger. The words a catechism he knew by heart, first use and beneficial purpose, the foundation of law in a lawless land. Looking at the seal, a memory, sharp and cold as a winter river, surfaced unbidden. He wasn't in the cabin anymore, but standing on the banks of a raging, brown dry willow a year ago. The spring thaw had come too fast, a sudden, violent melt that had turned the creek into a monster. He remembered the roar of it, the way the ground trembled, and he remembered his younger brother, Ethan, his face a pale oval in the churning water, one hand reaching, his mouth open in a shout that was swallowed by the flood. Ethan had been swept away trying to save a dozen ewes trapped by the rising water. They had found his body 3 miles downstream, tangled in the roots of a cottonwood tree. Since that day, the silence that had always been a part of Rowan had deepened, settling into his bones. He had buried Ethan, and with him, he had buried most of his words. The crowds and casual talk of town became unbearable, each voice a grating noise against the raw quiet of his grief. The ranch became his sanctuary and his prison, the flock his only congregation. The water, which had given his family life, had also dealt its cruelest blow. Now, Crow wanted to steal what was left of it, and the thought was a hot coal in Rowan's gut. He carefully folded the document and placed it back in its tin box, the scrape of metal on metal the only sound in the room. Later that morning, he rode with June Ellery to the abandoned storage barn that was to serve as her school. He kept a slight distance, his horse picking its way carefully over the rocky ground. He watched her, the way she sat her horse, straight-backed and determined, the wooden box of her trade held securely in her lap. She wore the same simple dress, now dusted with the red earth, and the heavy wool coat he had loaned her was folded neatly behind her saddle. She did not chatter or ask needless questions, and he was grateful for it. The barn was a derelict shell, its timbers silvered by the sun and wind. Swallows nested in the rafters, and the floor was a century of packed dirt and stray pieces of straw. But the light that streamed through the gaps in the walls was clear and bright, while Rowan checked the building's foundations, making sure it wouldn't collapse in the next strong wind. June set to work. She swept the floor with a makeshift broom of sagebrush, her movements brisk and efficient. She took a piece of charcoal from her box and, on the smoothest section of the barn's interior wall, drew a large, surprisingly steady rectangle. This would be their blackboard. The children came an hour later, trickling in from the scattered homesteads in the valley. There were 7 of them, ranging in age from 6 to 12. They were shy and wary, their faces smudged with dirt, their clothes patched and faded. But their eyes, when they looked at June, were bright with a fierce, hungry curiosity. As their parents had no money for school supplies, the children brought what they could. A boy named Samuel carried a three-legged stool, another a short plank of wood to sit on. A small girl with braids the color of wheat offered June a misshapen apple. June accepted it with a smile that transformed her face, making her seem younger, less like a stranger from the East. She began by drawing letters on the wall with her charcoal. A, B, C. Her voice was calm and even, a gentle current in the dusty silence of the barn. Rowan watched from a distance, leaning against a fence post, pretending to inspect his sheep grazing nearby. He saw the children lean forward, their initial shyness melting away under the warmth of her attention. He saw the boy, Samuel, successfully draw the letter AA in the dirt with a stick, and the look of pure, unadulterated pride that lit up his face. A feeling Rowan hadn't identified in a long time stirred within him. It was a fragile thing, like the first green shoots after a long winter. Hope. That afternoon, while June ate her simple lunch of bread and cheese under the shade of a lone mesquite tree, Rowan rode into Garnet Bend for supplies. The talk in the general store was a low hum of anxiety. The rumor had solidified into fact. Bishop Crow had a crew of men upriver, preparing to build a small dam. Not a big one, just enough to divert a significant portion of Dry Willow's flow into the reservoir that watered his thousands of cattle. It was a slow strangulation, and everyone knew it. They also knew there was little they could do. Crow had money, and money bought surveyors, lawyers, and the silence of officials. When Rowan returned to the school, the children were gone. June was wiping the charcoal letters from the wall with a damp rag. He dismounted and walked toward her, leading his horse. He unstrapped a canteen from his saddle. "For you," he said, holding it out. "Thank you, Mr. Pike." She took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. Her skin was cool. The feeling was as startling and brief as a spark from a flint. He felt his customary reserve slide back into place, a shield against the unfamiliar sensation. Their interactions were like this, functional and sparse, as cool and clear as the surface of the creek at sunrise. She took a sip of the water, and he saw the weariness in her posture. He found himself wanting to fill the silence, a rare impulse. "The children seem to take to you," he offered. It was more than he'd said to anyone all week. She managed a small smile. "They're bright. They just need a chance." She looked out over the valley, her gaze distant. "Everyone deserves a chance to start over." She paused, then seemed to make a decision. "I was a governess in Santa Fe. For a wealthy family." Her voice was devoid of self-pity, a simple statement of fact. Their son decided he wanted to marry me. His father thought it was a fine match, a way to secure a docile, educated wife to manage his household. She looked at Rowan then, her eyes direct. "They never asked me what I wanted. They saw me as another one of their possessions. Pretty, quiet, and easily managed. So I took my wages, my father's books, and I bought a ticket for the first coach heading west." He listened without interruption, recognizing a kindred spirit in her flight. She was running from a cage made of silk and expectation. He was trapped in one made of grief and isolation. The West was a place you came to escape the person you used to be. "This place," she said, gesturing to the dilapidated barn and the vast, empty landscape. "It may not be much, but it's mine. The choice was mine." He gave a slow, deliberate nod. He understood. He thought of Crow, of the closing fist around the town's water supply. He thought of the children and their broken chairs. "I'll watch over the school," he said, the words coming out before he had fully formed them. "I'm out here with the flock most days anyway. I'll keep an eye out, in case any of Crow's vultures get curious." Her expression softened. "Thank you." Rowan, she used his first name, and it sounded natural, not forward. Before she left for the day, she showed him something she'd done. on the wall opposite her charcoal blackboard. She had tacked up a large, colorful map of the United States. It was creased and worn from travel, with a small piece of red thread borrowed from her sewing kit. She had marked their location. "Look," she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "That's us, Garnet Bend." He leaned closer. It was an almost invisible speck in the vast, colored expanse of the Arizona Territory. A tiny, insignificant dot in a sea of paper deserts and mountains. To see their whole world, their life and death struggle over a single creek, reduced to a pinprick on a map, was both humbling and absurd. He felt a slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine smile in months. She smiled back, and in that shared moment, looking at their own smallness, the distance between them seemed to shrink. As she rode back toward the town, Rowan remained by the barn. A breeze came up from the south, carrying the dry, sweet scent of wild thyme from the hills. He watched her until she was just a small figure against the setting sun. A bond, as thin and fragile as that piece of red thread on her map, had begun to form. It was a tentative thing, barely there, but it was a tie to another person, and for the first time since Ethan's death, he didn't feel the urge to pull away. The thirst came on slowly, a tightening in the throat of Garnet Bend. It started as a whisper, a complaint about the well handles taking a few more pumps to bring up water. Then, within a week, it became a harsh reality. The water level in the 3 community wells dropped, the buckets coming up only half full of cloudy liquid. The final, damning sign was when the water began to taste of the deep earth, of mud and minerals that had been undisturbed for a generation. At Pike Hollow, the problem was more acute. Rowan's sheep, driven by a primal need, clustered around the nearly dry troughs, their bleats growing weaker, more desperate. He watched them, a knot of cold anger tightening in his stomach. They were hardy animals, born of this unforgiving land, but they could not survive without water. He saw the life draining out of his flock, a direct consequence of the chokehold being applied upriver. For the children at June's makeshift school, the thirst was a daily lesson in hardship. During their midday break, they no longer ran and played. Instead, they formed a solemn line with their pails and cups at the barn's sluggish well, waiting their turn to scoop up the murky dregs. Rowan took to moving his flock in the darkness, long before the sun rose, guiding them miles away to hidden seeps and springs only he knew, places where the water was just a trickle but was still clean. It was a grueling, exhausting effort that left him hollow-eyed and worn thin. He was avoiding a direct confrontation with Crow's men, buying time. But he knew time was a currency he was rapidly running out of. One evening, he rode into town, the silence of the street more profound than usual. He found Mabel Key at Sparrow's Rest, polishing glasses with a ferocity that suggested a deeper anger. The saloon was empty. "He bought him," she said without preamble, not even looking up from her work. Her voice was flat, devoid of surprise. "That surveyor from Prescott arrived 2 days ago, spent one night at Crow's Ranch, and left this morning with his saddlebags considerably heavier. The resurvey is a done deal. The official map will show the main channel of Dry Willow flowing right through Crow's deeded land. He'll have the law on his side." The news landed like a stone, sinking whatever small hope Rowan had harbored. It wasn't just a theft of water anymore. It was the theft of the law itself. He nodded grimly, the muscles in his jaw working. There was nothing to say. He turned and left, the weight of Mabel's words heavier than any saddle. The next day, the tension that had been simmering finally boiled over. June was in the middle of a lesson on arithmetic, her piece of charcoal scratching against the wooden wall. The children, 7 small figures perched on their mismatched stools and planks, were concentrating fiercely, their brows furrowed. The air was still and hot. The only sound, June's calm voice and the buzzing of flies. Then a shadow fell across the wide doorway. Silk Danner stood there, lounging against the frame. He wasn't alone. 2 other men from Crow's outfit stood behind him, their expressions a mixture of boredom and menace. Silk held a whittling knife in one hand, shaving a piece of wood into sharp points. His eyes, however, were fixed on June, a smirk playing on his thin lips. June paused, her hand hovering over the wall. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice steady, betraying none of the fear that had just jumped into her throat. "Just admiring the local educational facilities," Silk drawled, his gaze sweeping contemptuously over the rustic school. He took a step inside, his spurs scuffing the dirt floor. The children shrank back, their small faces turning pale. "Crow wants this land cleared, says it's an eyesore and a trespass." "This is a school," June stated, placing herself subtly between him and the children. "We are trespassing on no one's property." Silk chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Everything the light touches around here is Crow's property, ma'am, or will be soon." He flicked his wrist. The whittling knife flew through the air, a silver blur, and embedded itself with a solid thwack deep into the wooden wall. It quivered there, its point piercing the belly of the letter B she had just drawn. ABC, a lesson and a threat. Delivered in a single, violent act. A collective gasp came from the children. One of the younger girls began to cry softly. June's hand flew to her mouth, her knuckles white, but her eyes, wide with shock, did not leave Silk's face. The message was brutally clear. "You are not welcome here. Your words, your lessons, they mean nothing. This is all that matters." Before Silk could savor his intimidation, another figure filled the doorway. Rowan had been watching from a nearby ridge, as he always did. He had seen Crow's men ride up and had moved in silently, his feet making no sound on the dry ground. He wasn't wearing a gun belt, having left it at the cabin. His hands were empty. He didn't say a word. He simply walked towards Silk, his movements economical and deadly calm. Silk, seeing him, straightened up, his smirk faltering slightly as he took in the cold fire in Rowan's eyes. He reached instinctively for the pistol at his hip. He was too slow. Rowan's fist shot out, a single, precise, and powerful blow that connected with Silk's jaw with a sickening crunch. The force of it lifted Silk off his feet. He crashed backward onto the hard-packed earth, his head hitting the ground with a dull thud. He lay still, a trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth onto the dirt, staining the first letters of the alphabet the children had been learning. The other two men, stunned by the sudden, brutal efficiency of the attack, took a half-step back, their hands hovering uncertainly near their own weapons. June stood frozen for a heartbeat, her body trembling. Then, her training, her purpose, took over. She turned swiftly to the children, herding them behind her. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice shaking but firm. "Stay behind me. Don't look." She stood as a human shield, her simple dress a fragile barrier against the violence of this world. The sound of hoofbeats announced a new arrival. Bishop Crow himself rode up, reining in his magnificent white stallion just outside the barn. He was a large man, dressed in expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the dusty landscape. He surveyed the scene from his saddle, his man unconscious on the ground, Rowan standing over him like an avenging angel, and the schoolteacher protecting her flock. A slow, amused smile spread across his face. He seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. "Well, Pike," Crow said, his voice a rich, condescending baritone. "Exercising your frustrations, it won't bring the water back." He gestured expansively at the arid land around them. "It's a simple principle of nature. Water flows downhill, to the lowest point, and in this valley, the lowest point is my pocket." Rowan's hands were still clenched into fists. His entire body was rigid with a fury he was struggling to contain. But it was June who answered. She stepped forward slightly, her chin held high, her fear masked by a cold, clear anger. She looked directly up at the powerful man on his horse. "The law also flows, Mr. Crow. she said, her voice ringing with an unexpected authority, "if you know how to read it." Crow's smile faltered. He blinked, momentarily taken aback by this slip of a woman quoting the law at him. It was a language he was used to bending, not having it used against him. Rowan's gaze never left the other two men, daring them to move. He bent down, grasped the handle of the knife embedded in the wall, and wrenched it free. The wood splintered around the hole. He straightened up, holding the knife loosely in his hand. He didn't look at Crow. He looked at the two men who were now helping a groggy, bleeding Silk to his feet. "Touch this school again," Rowan said, his voice lethally quiet, each word spaced for emphasis. "Touch her or any of these children, and I will break your hands." It was not a boast. It was a promise, delivered with the chilling certainty of a final judgment. From the homesteads scattered across the valley, people watched. They were ghosts behind dusty window panes, shadows behind parted curtains. They saw the confrontation, the raw nerve of their community being exposed. But fear was a habit, ingrained deep. They watched, and they did nothing. Crow gathered his reins, his moment of amusement gone, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He had underestimated the shepherd and the schoolmarm. He shot a look of disgust at the still-dazed Silk. "Let's go," he snapped. Without another word, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow, dragging their wounded companion with them. Silence descended on the barn, broken only by the whimpering of the frightened child. Rowan stood for a long moment, the knife still in his hand, his chest heaving. June slowly turned back to her students, her face pale but composed, murmuring soft words of comfort. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery copper. The light washed over the small barn, over the bloodstain on the dirt floor, over the man and the woman who had made their stand. It was a beautiful, terrible sunset, the kind that promised not a peaceful rest, but a long, dark night to come. The violence of the previous day left a stain on the air, an invisible residue of fear and anger, but where Rowan's response was a coiled, waiting stillness. June Ellery's was a quiet, relentless industry. While her students were back at their homesteads, their parents too unnerved to send them to the school, June sought a different kind of lesson. She went to the one place in Garnet Bend that was older than the saloon and held more truths than any land deed, the small, sun-baked adobe church. Reverend Michaelis, a stooped, kindly man with eyes clouded by cataracts but a mind still sharp, granted her access to the parish records. They were kept in a heavy wooden chest in a small, stuffy room that smelled of dry paper, beeswax, and time itself. For hours, June sat with the great leather-bound ledgers, her fingers tracing the spidery, faded script of a preacher who had served the town 50 years prior. She wasn't looking for births or deaths. She was looking for the town's beginnings. She found it in a section detailing the church's own small plot of land, a donation from the town's founding families, tucked away in the margins of a land grant entry. Written in a cramped hand was a notation in Latin, the mark of an educated man. Aqua pertinet ad primum qui aperuit fontem. June's own classical education, a gift from her book-loving father, had not faded. Her breath caught. The water belongs to the first who opened the source. It wasn't a law written in a territorial statute book. It was older, a foundational principle of the frontier, a gentleman's agreement that had hardened into common law. It was a moral right, existing before surveyors and their paid-for lines on a map. She read the entry again and again, the faded ink a beacon in the dusty gloom. This was a weapon, but a weapon without a target. She had the principle, but she needed the proof of the first source. She found Rowan at his ranch, replacing a section of stone fence that had been weakened by the storm. He worked with a patient, rhythmic economy, his powerful hands selecting and placing the heavy stones as if he were solving a puzzle. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He simply straightened up as she approached, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. "I found something," she said, her voice breathless from her hurried ride. She explained her discovery in the church ledger, the Latin phrase, and its meaning. He listened, his expression unchanging, his gaze fixed on the distant line of the mesas. When she finished, he didn't speak for a long time. The only sound was the wind sighing through the sagebrush. He was turning something over in his mind, sifting through the layers of memory. "My father," he began, his voice low and distant, as if pulling the words from a deep well. He used to tell a story. When he was a boy, my grandfather brought him up to the high country, to the place where dry willow is born from the mountain. He said the first pike to settle this valley, my great-grandfather, found the source, a strong spring hidden in a tangle of rock and willow. He cleared it, dug it out, and let the water run free. My father said he marked it. June leaned forward, her heart pounding. How did he mark it?" "With a stone," Rowan said, his eyes finally meeting hers. "A big, flat piece of granite." He chiseled 2 letters into it. W.P. He called the place Willow's Prize. The pieces clicked into place. First to open the source, Willow's Prize. If they could find that stone, they would have proof that predated Crow's deeds, his money, his bought and paid for surveyor. They would have the truth. They set out the next morning, riding north toward the dark, brooding mass of Sageback Ridge. The brief respite from the weather had ended. A steady, miserable drizzle had begun to fall, turning the already scarred land into a slick, treacherous morass. The horses struggled, their hooves sinking deep into the clay, which sucked at them with a greedy, paste-like consistency. The world was reduced to shades of gray and brown, the sky a low, oppressive ceiling of weeping cloud. They rode in silence for the most part, bent forward in their saddles against the persistent rain. The journey was a battle, and words were an unnecessary luxury. Rowan led the way, his knowledge of the terrain absolute. He guided them along paths that were invisible to June, following the subtle contours of the land, his focus complete. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the ground grew more broken. They dismounted, leading the horses through a narrow, rock-strewn arroyo. It was there they saw the first sign, a set of boot prints, deep in the mud, that were not theirs. Rowan knelt, his fingers tracing the edge of one. "These aren't from around here," he said, his voice grim. "The sole is too perfect, factory-made, the heel is sharp. Ranchers wear their boots down until they're round." June's mind flashed to the men at her school, to Silk Danner, preening and arrogant. These were the tracks of a hired gun, not a working man. Alarm bells went off in her mind. They weren't just looking for a stone, they were following a trail. The tracks led them to the creek bed itself, which was running higher and faster than usual due to the rain, and there, they saw more signs. The earth along the bank was disturbed, turned over in messy clumps. Someone had been digging, recently. "They were looking for it," June whispered, a cold dread seeping into her. Crow knew. He knew about the marker and had sent his men to destroy the evidence. They searched frantically, their eyes scanning the muddy banks, the clusters of rock, the tangle of willow roots. The rain plastered their hair to their faces and soaked through their coats, but they barely noticed the cold. It was June who saw it first, a tiny glint of light in the gray mud, no bigger than her thumbnail. She knelt and carefully worked it free. It was a shard of glass, thick and curved. On its surface, etched with a fine, deliberate hand, was the letter D. "A compass," Rowan said, looking at the shard in her palm. "A fancy one. Silk Danner carries one on his belt. Saw him flashing it in the saloon last week." The evidence was piling up, a dark and damning story written in the mud. But the marker stone was still missing. They pushed further upstream, their hope beginning to fade. Then, as they rounded a sharp bend where the creek narrowed into a small canyon, they saw it. It was an ugly, brutal thing. A makeshift dam of heavy burlap sandbags had been thrown across the creek, choking the natural flow. Water pooled behind it, dark and stagnant, before being diverted into a freshly dug channel that led east, in the direction of Crow's vast ranch. It was crude, but effective. It was the physical proof of the crime, the reason for the town's thirst, the source of the dying flocks. A low, guttural sound of pure rage escaped Rowan's throat. In 2 strides, he was at the edge of the dam, his hands balled into fists, his body radiating a murderous fury. He looked ready to tear the entire structure apart with his bare hands. "I'll tear it down," he snarled, his voice a raw rasp. "I'll tear it down and let the water run where it's supposed to." "No, wait!" June scrambled after him, grabbing his arm. His muscles were like iron bands beneath his wet shirt. "Rowan, don't think." "I'm done thinking," he shot back, turning to face her. His eyes were blazing. "This is the proof. This is his theft." "Yes," she insisted, her grip tightening on his arm, her face inches from his. "And if you destroy it, it's just your word against his. This is the evidence." "Rowan, we need to show it to a judge. Not just release the water. We need the justice of the law, not just the justice of your fists." Her words, sharp and clear, even over the rush of the water, seemed to penetrate his rage. He stared at her, his chest heaving, the conflict warring within him. He saw the logic in her argument, the cold, hard sense of it. Vengeance felt good, but justice, true justice, was the only thing that would last. Slowly, agonizingly. The tension drained from his shoulders, his fists uncurled. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice now quiet, spent. "We document it," she said, her own mind now racing, seizing the initiative. "We prove it was here, exactly as it is." Working quickly, they used a length of rope from Rowan's saddle to measure the dam's width and height. They drove stakes into the ground to mark its precise location. Then, taking a piece of oilskin and a pencil from her satchel, June began to draw. With practiced, steady hands, she sketched a detailed map of the site, the dam, the diversion channel, the location of the boot prints, the spot where she found the compass shard. It was a clear, undeniable diagram of the crime. When she was finished, Rowan produced a waterproof leather tube from his saddlebags, the kind used for carrying important documents. She carefully rolled the oilskin map and slid it inside. Sealing the cap tight, they had their evidence, secure and protected. The journey back was even more treacherous. The rain had intensified, and the steep game trail they were following had become a slick, muddy slide. June, exhausted and emotionally drained, was leading her horse when her foot slipped on a wet rock hidden beneath the mud. She cried out, her arms flailing as she lost her balance and began to fall backward toward the steep drop-off. In a flash, Rowan was there. He dropped the reins of his own horse and lunged, his arm wrapping around her waist like a steel band. He pulled her back from the edge, his body shielding hers as they stumbled together against the muddy hillside. She landed hard against his chest, the air knocked from her lungs. For a moment, they just stayed there, locked together. Her face was pressed against his wet wool coat, and she could feel the powerful, frantic thud of his heart against her cheek, a wild drumbeat that matched her own. The roar of the creek below and the drumming of the rain all faded into a distant hum. The world had shrunk to this single, desperate point of contact. He held her tight, his hand splayed across her back, his breath warm against her hair. She tilted her head back to look at him. His face was streaked with mud and rain, his expression intense, a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't name. It was raw, unguarded. She felt a tremor run through her, a shudder that had nothing to do with the cold. "Don't let me go," she whispered, the words a plea that was about more than just the fall from the cliff. He looked down at her, his dark eyes holding hers. A long moment passed, a silent conversation taking place in the heart of the storm. When he finally spoke, His voice was different than she had ever heard it before. The hard, gravelly edge was gone, replaced by a low, rough gentleness that was more startling than any shout. Wasn't planning on it. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the desert scrubbed clean and smelling of wet cedar and rain-soaked earth. They couldn't make it back to the ranch before nightfall, so Rowan led them to a sheltered alcove of rock and juniper known as Cedar Wash. The air was cold, but the sky was a vast, clear dome of the deepest indigo, littered with stars so bright they seemed to have been spilled like a sack of white-hot salt. He built a fire with the easy, practiced motions of a man who had spent 1,000 nights under the open sky. The flames caught, grew, and pushed back the immense darkness, creating a small, warm bubble of light and life in the vast wilderness. His sheep, weary from the day's trek, settled nearby in a quiet, breathing circle, their woolly bodies a soft wall against the night. They were safe here, in this temporary home carved from the darkness. They ate in a comfortable silence, sharing the last of the bread and dried meat from Rowan's saddlebags. The fire crackled and spat, sending embers dancing up into the darkness like short-lived stars. In the flickering light, the harsh lines of the day seemed to soften. Rowan's face, usually a mask of stoic reserve, looked younger, the shadows playing in the hollows of his cheeks. June's eyes reflected the firelight, and the weariness she felt was tempered by a sense of profound peace. "He wanted me to learn the harp," she said, her voice soft, barely disturbing the quiet. Rowan looked up from the flame he'd been watching, his attention captured. "The man in Santa Fe? My suitor." She said the word as if it were a foreign object on her tongue. "He said my hands were made for it. He bought me dresses of silk, in blues and greens, to match my eyes. He said I was the most beautiful ornament for his home." She picked up a small twig and drew a meaningless pattern in the dirt by her feet. "He never once asked me what I was thinking. He only cared how I looked while I was thinking it. He wanted a pretty bird in a gilded cage. He didn't realize the cage door was never truly locked." Rowan listened, his stillness a form of deep attention. He didn't offer platitudes or easy words of sympathy. He simply listened, granting her story the weight and respect it deserved. His right hand rested on his knee, his thumb rhythmically tapping the side of a small wooden matchbox he'd pulled from his pocket. The tiny, repetitive sound was a counterpoint to the crackle of the fire, a small, nervous energy in his otherwise solid presence. A sudden gust of wind swept down from the ridge, cold and sharp. It carried the scent of pine from the high country and the promise of a deep desert chill. June shivered, pulling her damp coat tighter around her shoulders, the fabric offering little warmth. Without a word, Rowan rose and retrieved his heavy wool greatcoat from his saddle. It was the same one he had loaned her in town, still carrying the faint, clean scent of sagebrush and him. He didn't just hand it to her. He came and stood behind her, draping it carefully over her shoulders. The coat's weight was a solid, comforting presence, and it carried the residual warmth of his own body. As he settled it around her, his fingers brushed the nape of her neck, a brief, accidental touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the wool. He returned to his seat by the fire, leaving a smaller space between them than before. "Thank you," she said quietly. He gave a slight nod, his eyes on the flames again. The firelight carved his profile from the darkness. She saw the tension in his jaw, the deep-set weariness in his eyes. He was a man who carried his solitude like a shield. She felt a sudden, powerful urge to know what lay behind it. "You're afraid," she said, the words a soft realization rather than an accusation. He didn't flinch or deny it. The rhythmic tapping on the matchbox stopped. "I had a brother," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He stared deep into the fire, as if seeing a ghost in the flames. "Younger. Ethan. The water took him. A flash flood. Last spring. 1 minute he was there, on the bank. The next he was gone." The simple, unadorned facts of the story held more power than any embellished tale of grief. He spoke of it as a man who had replayed the memory 1,000,000 times, a smooth, worn stone of pain he carried in his soul. "It teaches you," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "This land, it teaches you not to hold on too tight to anything or anyone. The current is always there, waiting to pull it away." His loneliness wasn't a choice. It was a scar, a fortress he had built around his heart to protect it from another flood. The silence that followed was thick with his unspoken grief. June looked at his hands, resting on his knees. They were strong, capable hands, scarred and calloused from a life of hard work. A long, faded white scar snaked across the back of his right hand, from the knuckle to the wrist. Slowly, she reached out. Her fingers were hesitant at first, then found their resolve. She gently laid her hand over his, her touch light as a moth's wing. She traced the path of the scar with her thumb. He flinched almost imperceptibly at the contact, but he did not pull away. "These lines," she said, her voice soft but sure, "they aren't ugly. They are a map of where you've been, of what you've survived." He turned his head and looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the walls of the fortress begin to crumble. He turned his hand over and curled his fingers around hers, his grip surprisingly gentle. He moved closer, and she did the same. Drawn by an invisible current, the warmth between them was now more potent than the fire. The air grew thick, charged with all the things they had not said, all the feelings they had kept locked away. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips, and the entire world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the golden circle of the firelight. The kiss was not graceful. It was hesitant, clumsy, a question asked in a language they were both just learning. It was the meeting of two solitudes, a collision of loneliness and hope. His lips were chapped from the wind, but they were warm. It was short, a brief, searing touch that ended as they both pulled back slightly, breathless, their foreheads almost touching. The sound of their breathing was loud in the sudden silence. The fire had burned low, the flames now soft, pulsing tongues of orange and blue. The world felt quiet, respectful, in the soft glow. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the raw emotion he had kept hidden for so long. She saw the man, not the lonely rancher. She lifted a hand to his cheek, her thumb stroking the rough stubble along his jaw. Her own heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs. "Touch me," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the wind. "Like you really mean it." It was not a demand for passion, but a plea for honesty, a request for the man behind the shield. For a long moment, he was perfectly still. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that was imbued with a profound significance, he reached to his side. He picked up his worn leather riding gloves, the symbols of his work, his isolation, his guard against the world, and he placed them carefully on a rock beside the fire. He was laying down his arms. He turned back to her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. He slid one hand around her waist and the other to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He drew her to him, not with force, but with an irresistible certainty. He didn't kiss her again. Instead, he simply held her, pressing his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes, and she felt a tremor run through his powerful frame. It was a complete surrender, an acceptance of the fragile, terrifying, beautiful thing that was growing between them. The passion was there, a deep, simmering heat that flowed between them, but it was held in check by a powerful current of tenderness and reverence. He held her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world, and at the same time, the anchor that could save him from being swept away. A few drops of rain began to fall, hissing as they struck the embers of the fire. Rowan had stretched a small canvas tarp between two junipers to create a makeshift shelter. He drew her under it, and they sat with their backs against the smooth, warm rock of the alcove, his arm still securely around her, his greatcoat a shared blanket against the night. They leaned against each other, listening to the gentle drumming of the rain on the canvas, and in the quiet darkness of Cedar Wash, for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt alone. The loneliness that had stalked them both retreated into the night, like a wild animal returning to the deeper shadows. The peace of the morning at Pike Hollow was a fragile, dew-kissed thing. It was a peace born of the shared warmth of a campfire and the silent understanding that had passed between them in the dark. But it was a peace belonging to the high country, and it could not survive the descent into the world of men. When they rode back toward the schoolhouse, a sense of foreboding settled over them, heavy and gray as the morning mist. They saw the destruction from a quarter-mile away. The door to the barn hung crookedly on a single hinge, like a broken jaw. As they drew closer, the full scope of the morning's work became clear. Silk Danner and two of Crow's men were just finishing. They had not been quiet about it. They had used a sledgehammer. The children's small, three-legged stools and wooden planks were smashed into kindling. But the main target of their rage had been the blackboard. The smooth interior wall that June had so carefully claimed for her lessons was now a landscape of splintered wood and deep gouges. A great, jagged crack ran right through the middle, splitting the letters A, B, and C in two. It was a brutish, ugly scar. A declaration of war not on a person, but on an idea. Silk Danner saw them approach. He tossed the sledgehammer to one of his men and sauntered forward, a cruel, satisfied smirk on his face. His jaw was still bruised from his encounter with Rowan's fist, a mottled purple that only made his expression more malevolent. "Morning, teacher," he drawled, his eyes lingering on June with insolent appraisal. "Just making a few improvements." The boss felt the decor was a little temporary. Rowan swung down from his horse, his body moving with a coiled tension that was more dangerous than any shout. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes dark with a cold, contained fury. He said nothing, but his silence was a physical weight on the air. June dismounted more slowly, her gaze fixed on the wreckage. She looked at the splintered alphabet, the symbol of the new beginning she had tried to build, now lying in ruins. For a single, fleeting moment, a wave of despair washed over her, so profound it threatened to buckle her knees. This was what they were up against, a brute force that could not be reasoned with, that only knew how to destroy. Then she looked past the barn and saw them, her students. They were gathered in a small, silent cluster on a nearby rise, their parents holding them back. They had come for school, only to find this. Their small faces were filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. And in that moment, looking at them, the despair in June's heart was burned away by a clean, hot flame of pure defiance. She had worn a different dress today, a simple garment of blue cotton, the color of a clear summer sky. It was an unconscious choice, a desire for something bright and hopeful after the grimness of the previous day. Now, it felt like a uniform. She walked past Silk Danner as if he were a piece of furniture, her back straight, her head held high. She stopped on the broken threshold of the barn, a small figure in blue silhouetted against the wreckage. She turned to face her students. "Class will be held outside this morning," she announced, her voice clear and carrying in the still morning air. There was not a tremor in it. "Please, find a place to sit on the ground. The first lesson is on resilience." Silk's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of baffled fury. This was not the reaction he had expected. He had come for tears and fear, for the satisfying spectacle of a defeated woman. He was not prepared for a lesson plan. Before he could react, another sound broke the tense silence. It was the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel, the rasp of a saw cutting through wood. Rowan had ignored the vandals entirely. He had ridden to his small wagon, which he had left tethered nearby, and had begun to work. He unloaded long, straight planks of cypress wood, a toolbox, and a heavy wooden mallet. With an efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch, he began to build. He was not just a shepherd. He was a craftsman, a man who knew the language of wood and tools as well as he knew the patterns of the stars. In less than an hour, while June conducted her lesson with a piece of charcoal on a large, flat rock, Rowan constructed a new blackboard. It was a simple, sturdy thing, a large, smooth plank of cypress, framed and mounted on two thick posts that he drove deep into the unyielding earth. He set it up in the open, under the vast Arizona sky. It was bigger, stronger, and more permanent than the wall inside the barn had ever been. It was an answer delivered in wood and sweat, a monument to their refusal to be broken. This public act of defiance was too much for Crow to ignore. Word reached him quickly, and his response was swift and brutal. As the midday sun beat down, 4 of his men rode up, this time led not by Silk, but by a harder, colder man named Lassiter. They did not ride to the school. They rode straight for June. 2 of them dismounted, grabbing her by the arms. She cried out in surprise as they half-dragged, half-carried her away from the children and toward the main track that led to town. The children screamed, scattering in fear. "Let her go!" Rowan roared, dropping his hammer and starting after them. But Lassiter and the other riders spurred their horses between them, cutting him off, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. They dragged June into the middle of the dusty road, a public spectacle for the entire valley to witness. From the windows of the saloon and the general store, faces appeared, then vanished. Doors that had been open were quietly closed. The town of Garnet Bend held its breath, pulling back into its shell. Its fear, a palpable thing. Rowan stood alone in the road, facing the 4 armed men. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his hands empty. "Get to her," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the silence. "You go through me first." Lassiter's men hesitated, their bravado wavering in the face of the unarmed man's absolute conviction. They had seen the result of his anger on Silk Danner's face. They were 4 to his 1, but they knew this was not a fight that would be won easily. Just then, a new figure bustled onto the scene. Deputy Ellis Morrow, a portly man whose uniform was stretched tight across his ample belly, puffed his way into the middle of the standoff. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his face was flushed with a mixture of self-importance and genuine alarm. Now then, he blustered, holding up his hands as if to halt a rampaging herd. "Let's have no trouble here. This is an official matter for the law to handle. Mr. Lassiter, you and your men will stand down. Mr. Pike, you will refrain from any incitement." It was a fine performance, but it was a sham. Morrow was posturing, creating the illusion of control while doing nothing to resolve the situation. He was Crow's man as much as the surveyor had been, a buffer of legal nonsense designed to stall and confuse until Crow's will was done. But then a different sound began to cut through the deputy's blathering. It started quietly. A single, high voice. It was Samuel, the boy with the 3-legged stool. He had crept back, and he was standing near the new blackboard. "Hey," he said, his voice trembling but clear. Another child joined him. B, then another. C. June, held fast by Crow's men, heard them. A fierce, proud light came into her eyes. "Louder," she called out, her voice ringing with the command of a true teacher. "From the beginning, all of you." The children, emboldened by her courage, took a collective breath. They chanted in unison. BCD, their voices, small and reedy on their own, joined together to create a sound that was pure and powerful. It was the sound of defiance, the sound of the future. It rolled down the dusty street, a rhythmic, unstoppable chorus that completely drowned out the deputy's sputtering protests and the nervous shuffling of Crow's gunmen. Lassiter's men looked increasingly uncomfortable. They were hired to intimidate, to break things, to be feared. They had no instructions on how to fight the alphabet. Then, The bat-wing doors of Sparrow's Rest swung open. Mabel Key stepped out onto the porch. She held a half-empty bottle of whiskey in one hand and a cleaning rag in the other, as if she had just been interrupted in her work. She leaned against a post and watched the scene with a look of withering contempt. She fixed her sharp eyes on Deputy Morrow. "You know, Alice," she said, her voice carrying with the easy authority of a woman who had seen everything. "The law's a funny thing. It's meant for people who can read, so they can understand their rights." She paused, setting the whiskey bottle down on the railing with a deliberate clink. Then, she lifted the hem of her long skirt just enough to reveal the butt of a large Colt revolver tucked neatly into her waistband. "And it's meant for people who can shoot, so they can make sure the readers are understood." She let the skirt fall and gave the deputy a look that could have curdled milk. "You might want to decide which group you belong to. And quick." That was the tipping point. The sight of Mabel Key, armed and utterly unafraid, seemed to break the spell of fear that held the town. Lassiter looked from the chanting children to the determined shepherd to the saloon owner with a gun, and he made a decision. This was not a fight that was going to be won today. At that moment, Bishop Crow himself appeared at the far end of the street, astride his white stallion, having watched the entire failed drama unfold. He saw his men faltering. He heard the children's relentless chant, and his face darkened with fury. He spurred his horse forward, not to join the fight, but to end it. He reined in sharply, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust. He glared at Rowan, then at June, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. With a final, disgusted look at his hesitant men, he spat a thick wad of tobacco juice into the dust. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. As he left, he threw a last, chilling promise over his shoulder, the words hanging in the air like a curse tonight. The creek falls silent. The threat was unmistakable. The standoff was over, but the war had just entered its final, most dangerous phase. The children's chant finally faltered and died out as Crow's men disappeared. A profound silence fell over the street. June's captors had released her, and she stood alone for a moment in the dust, her blue dress a small flag of victory. Rowan walked to her side. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid wall of support. He looked from her pale, determined face to the small cluster of children who were now running toward her, their fear replaced with the elation of an unexpected triumph. They gathered around her, tugging on her dress, their faces alight. He looked at this scene, the teacher in her simple blue dress, surrounded by her small, devoted students, standing before a newly built blackboard under an endless sky, and he thought that he had just witnessed the impossible. A small school, with no weapons but its voice, had just won a battle against an army of armed men. The final words of Bishop Crow's threat hung in the air long after he was gone, a poison that seeped into the twilight. Tonight, the creek falls silent, to the townsfolk cowering behind their doors. It might have sounded like a simple promise to complete his dam, to choke the flow for good, but Rowan Pike, a man who understood the moods and terrible power of water, heard the true meaning, and it turned his blood to ice. The sky broke, not with rain, but with a threat. Thunder cracked, a dry, angry whip crack that echoed from the peaks. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of ozone and damp earth. A low, continuous rumble began. A vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. The storm that had been brewing all day was about to unleash its fury. Rowan looked at the bruised, purple clouds massing over Sageback Ridge. He looked at the darkening land, and the truth hit him like a physical blow. Crow wasn't just stealing the water. He was going to turn it into a weapon. The makeshift dam, weakened and poorly built, would never hold against a flash flood. Crow wasn't going to just stop the creek. He was going to break the dam, release a torrent of hoarded water and storm runoff, and let it scour the valley clean. A flood. With Rowan Pike's name written all over it, they would say his rage had led him to destroy the dam, and in doing so, destroy the very thing he fought to protect. It was a cunning, diabolical plan. "He's going to break it," Rowan said, his voice a harsh rasp. He was speaking to June, but his eyes were fixed on the mountains. "Break the dam," June asked, her mind catching up to his. "But why he'd lose all the water he's diverted?" "He doesn't care," Rowan said, already moving, his body a blur of urgent purpose. "He wants to blame me. He wants to wash us all away." There was no more time for words. He ran for the horses, his long strides eating up the ground. June followed without hesitation, her mind racing, her heart hammering against her ribs. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, striking the dry earth with audible splats. The ride up to Thistle Spur was a desperate, frantic battle against the night and the storm. The world went black, a suffocating ink-black darkness that swallowed the trail whole. They rode blind, guided only by Rowan's instinct and the horse's memory of the treacherous terrain. The rain came down in a solid, driving sheet, a vertical river that soaked them to the skin in seconds. Lightning tore the sky open, and for a split second, the world was illuminated in a stark, ghostly white. In those flashes, June saw the landscape twisted junipers, jagged rocks, the path a muddy ribbon winding into the abyss. Then the darkness would slam back down, more profound than before, leaving the terrifying image burned onto her retinas. The thunder was a constant, deafening roar, a physical concussion that shook the ground beneath the horses' pounding hooves. They pushed the animals relentlessly, mud and water flying from their hooves. This was no longer a ride. It was a controlled fall through chaos. They heard the rising creek before they saw it, a deep, angry roar that grew louder with every step. When another flash of lightning lit the canyon, they saw that the water was no longer a creek. It was a churning, brown monster, already licking at the edges of the trail. They rounded the final bend and saw a single, flickering light ahead, a lantern, its yellow flame dancing wildly in the wind, hung from a tree branch near the makeshift dam. In its unsteady glow, they saw him, Silk Danner. He was kneeling beside the wall of sandbags, his back to them. He was working at something, his movements quick and furtive. Rowan swung down from his horse before the animal had even come to a full stop. He landed silently in the mud and began to move forward, a predator stalking his prey. June dismounted as well, her heart in her throat, grabbing a heavy, iron-headed hoe that had been strapped to Rowan's pack, a tool for clearing irrigation ditches. As they got closer, the acrid smell of oil hit them. The burlap sacks of the dam were dark and slick with it. Silk was not trying to break the dam with a shovel. He was trying to light it on fire. The oil-soaked burlap would burn, the sacks would burst, and the wall would collapse. Rowan was almost on him when Silk heard them. He spun around, his face a mask of alarm in the lantern light. He dropped the torch he was holding and clawed for the pistol at his hip. Rowan hit him like a falling boulder. They went down in a spray of muddy water, a tangle of limbs and fury. A flash of lightning illuminated the brutal, desperate struggle. Rowan's fist rose and fell. Silk kicked and clawed. The dropped torch lay sputtering in a puddle, its flame threatening to die out. But a new, larger flame had caught. A small section of the burlap was now burning, the fire spreading with terrifying speed despite the rain. "The fire," June screamed. While Rowan pinned a struggling Silk to the ground, she ran forward. She lifted the heavy hoe, its weight awkward in her hands. She swung it with all her might, not at the men, but at the burning section of the dam. The iron head of the tool slapped into the mud, scooping up a heavy wedge of dirt and water. She swung again, a desperate, clean arc, and flung the muddy slurry onto the flames. The fire hissed, fought back for a moment, and then died, smothered under the wet earth. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the roar of the storm, sharp and loud. A bullet tore through the air, ripping a hole in the collar of Rowan's shirt. So close he felt the heat of its passage. They both froze. On the ridge above them, silhouetted for a moment by another flash of lightning, sat Bishop Crow on his white stallion. He held a smoking pistol in his hand. "Get away from my property," Pike Crow's voice boomed over the thunder. Rowan rose slowly, pushing a dazed and bleeding Silk away from him. He and June were exposed, trapped in the narrow canyon. And then, from the shadows down the trail, a voice called out, "I reckon this is town property now. Bishop." It was Mabel Key. She had ridden up behind them, a shotgun held ready in her hands. She had seen them leave, had understood the danger, and had followed. Crow's attention swiveled to this new threat. That single moment of distraction was all June needed. She pulled the waterproof leather tube from her belt. "Mabel," she shouted, her voice cutting through the wind. "Catch!" She threw the tube with a strong, overhand motion. It sailed through the rain-swept air, a dark arc against the stormy sky. Mabel caught it with one hand, her eyes never leaving Crow. She tucked it safely inside her coat. The evidence was safe. A low, terrible groan came from the dam. The sheer weight of the rising water was too much for the amateurish structure. A dark line of water appeared at the top. Then another. The dam was failing. "The bridge," Rowan roared, grabbing June's arm. A rickety wooden bridge, built for shepherds and their flocks, spanned the canyon 100 yards downstream. It was their only way back. They scrambled for their horses, pulling them toward the bridge as the groaning from the dam grew louder. They had just reached the edge of the bridge when the dam exploded. It didn't break. It disintegrated. A solid wall of black water, 10 feet high, surged down the narrow canyon. It hit the bend with the force of a locomotive, a churning mass of mud, rocks, and the debris of the dam. The bridge shuddered as the first wave of the flood slammed into its supports. The roar was deafening. "Go!" Rowan yelled, shoving June and her horse forward onto the trembling planks. "Go now!" He pushed her horse across the violently shaking bridge, then turned to follow with his own. She made it to the other side, turning just in time to see a massive cottonwood log ripped from the bank upstream, slam into the bridge supports right where Rowan was. The bridge splintered, groaned, and collapsed. Rowan and his horse were thrown into the raging torrent. June screamed his name, a sound of pure terror that was swallowed by the flood. She saw his head break the surface once, his face a pale slash in the black water. He was being swept away, tossed and turned in the maelstrom. Wagon wheels, fence posts, and the heavy burlap sacks churned around him. He was going to die. The same water that had taken his brother was taking him. But then his hand shot out of the water, grabbing onto the splintered remains of a bridge post that was still anchored to the bank. He held on, his body trailing in the current like a flag, the full, immense power of the flood trying to rip him away. June ran to the edge of the collapsed bank. He was 10 feet away, his knuckles white, his grip failing. She threw herself onto the muddy ground, her arm outstretched. "Rowan!" she screamed. "My hand!" He looked up, his face contorted with effort. He let go with one hand and reached for her. Their fingers brushed, missed, then caught. She gripped his hand with a strength she didn't know she possessed, a strength born of terror and love. The current ripped at him, pulling her forward. The mud of the bank gave way, and she slid toward the water, her heels digging uselessly into the slick earth. But she did not let go. "I've got you!" she screamed into the storm. "I will not let you go." She held on, her muscles screaming, her arm feeling as if it were being torn from its socket. He used her grip to find a footing, to fight the current, to pull himself inch by agonizing inch out of the flood's deadly embrace. He collapsed on the wet ground beside her, gasping for air, his body trembling with cold and exhaustion. They lay there, face to face in the mud, the rain falling on them like a thick, gray curtain, shutting out the rest of the world. His hand was still locked in hers. He was alive. He was breathing. The roaring of the flood was a distant sound now, secondary to the roaring of the blood in her ears and the frantic beating of her own heart. She looked into his eyes, dark pools in the stormy night. She brought his hand, the one she had held, the one that had saved him, and pressed it fiercely against her chest, holding it there with both of her own. She wanted him to feel her heart, to feel the life he had almost lost, the life she would not let him lose. Through the drumming of the rain, her voice was a fierce, ragged whisper, a vow made in the heart of the storm. "Don't you ever leave me again." The morning broke gray and bruised, revealing a valley transformed. Dry Willow Creek was a wide, brown scar, its banks ripped and torn, littered with the debris of the flood. But the water, though muddy, was flowing again in its rightful channel. The chokehold had been broken. The town of Garnet Bend, however, was not quiet. A current of energy, a mixture of fear and a strange, unfamiliar hope, crackled in the air. The source of this energy was Mabel Key. She strode from the saloon, not with a whiskey bottle, but with a purpose that was as solid and unyielding as the mountains. In one hand, she carried June's waterproof leather tube. In the other, she held a piece of greasy, oil-soaked burlap, a relic from the destroyed dam. She didn't stop at the sheriff's office. She marched straight to the church, threw open the heavy doors, and laid her evidence on the altar as if it were a holy sacrament. "There will be a town meeting," she declared to the empty pews. Her voice, accustomed to commanding a room of rowdy cowboys, echoed in the sacred space. "And the law will listen." Words spread like a grass fire, first in trickles, then in a steady stream. The townsfolk emerged from their homes. They were drawn by a force stronger than their curiosity. They filed into the church, their faces pale and uncertain, filling the pews, their work-worn hands clasped nervously in their laps. Rowan and June arrived together, soaked and mud-stained, but standing tall. They stood near the front, a silent, united front. The assembly was brought to a sputtering halt by the arrival of Deputy Ellis Morrow. He bustled in, his face red and puffed with indignation. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice trying for authority but achieving only a wheezing bluster. "This is an unlawful assembly. Disperse at once. Go back to your homes. This is a matter for proper channels. The proper channels are a little flooded this morning. Ellis..." Mabel shot back from her position by the altar. "We've decided to make our own..." Just as Morrow was about to puff himself up for another round of empty threats, a voice, calm and sharp as a shard of glass, cut through the room. "An unlawful assembly is one that threatens the peace. Deputy, this gathering, it seems to me, is attempting to secure it." All heads turned. A man had risen from a back pew, where he had been sitting unnoticed. He was a stranger, lean and weathered, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. He was dressed in a simple but well-made traveling suit, now damp and mud-splattered at the cuffs. "My carriage suffered a mishap in your recent weather," the man said, walking forward with a steady, authoritative gait. "I was forced to take shelter here last night. My name is Avery Stone. I am a circuit judge for this territory." A collective gasp went through the room. The law, the real law, had arrived in Garnet Bend, delivered by the storm. Judge Stone surveyed the room, his eyes taking in the tense faces, the evidence on the altar, and the flustered deputy. "Given the circumstances," he announced, his voice ringing with an authority Morrow could only dream of, "and to prevent any further escalation of violence, I am convening an official territorial hearing right here, right now. Deputy, you will act as bailiff." Ellis Morrow's jaw dropped. He looked like a fish that had just been told to fly. Before anyone could object, the church doors opened again. Bishop Crow strode in, flanked by a man in a slick city suit, his face a mask of arrogant composure. He had ridden hard from his ranch, having seen the gathering and summoned his lawyer, who had been staying with him. "Judge Stone," Crow said with a smooth, confident smile. "A pleasure. My attorney, Mr. Davies from Prescott. We are here to file a complaint against one Rowan Pike for the malicious destruction of private property. Judge Stone's expression did not change. Your complaint is noted. Mr. Crow, you will have your turn, but the town convened this meeting. They will speak first. Madam, he said, turning to Mabel Key, you may begin. Mabel presented her evidence with a clear, no-nonsense narrative. She unrolled June's map, the detailed drawing of the illegal dam, and held it up for all to see. She presented the oil-soaked burlap. She told of following them, of hearing the gunshot, of seeing Crow on the ridge. Crow's lawyer, Mr. Davies, rose smoothly to his feet. Your Honor, this is the hysterical tale of a saloon keeper. A crude drawing and a piece of trash prove nothing. The fact is, Mr. Pike, a man known for his volatile temper, was enraged by a lawful water diversion and took matters into his own hands, endangering the entire valley. His voice was like oiled machinery, logical and dismissive. He argued the law of capital, of investment, of deeds and surveys. Water, he concluded, belongs to the man with the resources and vision to control it for the betterment of the territory. Does that betterment include threatening children, Mr. Davies? The new voice was quiet, but it cut through the lawyer's rhetoric like a razor. June Ellery stepped forward. She held the old, leather-bound church ledger in her hands. This is the original parish record of Garnet Bend. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm and steady. It predates every deed Mr. Crow possesses. On page 47, it details the founding of this community and the establishment of its resources. She looked directly at the judge. It contains a notation regarding the water rights of Dry Willow Creek, based on a principle as old as this territory, aqua pertinet ad primum qui aperuit fontem. The water belongs to the first who opened the source. She explained how the Pike family had discovered and cleared the spring, a fact memorialized by the marker stone known as Willow's Prize, which Crow's men had tried to find and destroy. Davies scoffed. Your Honor, we are discussing legal, surveyed property lines, not dusty folklore from a church diary. In the absence of established territorial statutes, Mr. Davies, Judge Stone countered, his eyes glinting, folklore, when it establishes precedent and tradition, is the law. Continue, Miss Ellery. When she had finished, Davies turned his attack on Rowan. And this man, this silent shepherd, is he not the one who assaulted Mr. Danner at the school? Is he not the one who brought violence into this matter? Rowan, who had been standing silent and still as a stone, took one step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply lifted a hand and pointed to the torn, powder-singed hole in the collar of his shirt. He said nothing, but his eyes never left Bishop Crow's. The silence in the room was absolute. A bullet hole speaks louder than any lawyer. Judge Stone's gaze shifted, landing on Silk Danner, who was trying to make himself invisible in the crowd, his bruised face a sickly green. Mr. Danner. The judge's voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a hammer. Step forward. Silk shuffled forward, his eyes darting everywhere but at the judge. Mr. Danner, did you or did you not douse those sandbags in oil with the intent to set them ablaze? Silk swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I was just... He stammered. Were you acting on your own? The judge pressed, his voice hardening. Or were you following an order? Silk's eyes flickered to Crow. He saw no help there, only a look of cold, murderous rage. He looked at Rowan's unwavering stare. He looked at the judge's implacable face. The weight was too much. The weak link in Crow's chain of power finally snapped. It was an order, he blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear and sweat. He told me to do it. He said to burn it, to break the dam and make it look like Pike did it. I was just following orders. A collective gasp went through the church. Bishop Crow's face turned a shade of deep, apoplectic purple. His lawyer stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, His elegant arguments turned to dust. Judge Stone needed no more. He stood, and the room fell silent. "This court has heard enough," he announced. "Based on the historical precedent presented by Miss Ellery and the testimony given, I find that the primary water rights to Dry Willow Creek, by tradition and common law, belong to this community. Any and all man-made diversions are hereby declared illegal." He then turned his gaze, cold as a winter morning, on Crow. "Furthermore, I find Bishop Crow guilty of the unlawful endangerment of this community. You will pay for the full repair of any and all damage caused by this flood. You will remove, at your own expense, all obstructions from the creek, and you will pay a fine to the territory for this flagrant abuse of power." For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The town of Garnet Bend had forgotten what victory felt like. Then, a single person began to clap. It was the boy, Samuel. Then another joined in, and another. The hesitant applause grew into a wave, a roar of relief and joy that filled the small church, washing away the years of fear. Several of the children, tears streaming down their faces, ran and threw their arms around June's waist. In the commotion, Deputy Ellis Morrow began to sidle toward the door, hoping to make a quiet escape. He was stopped by a firm hand clamping down on his ear. "And where do you think you're going?" Mabel Key said, her voice dripping with sweet venom. She twisted his ear, making the portly deputy yelp. "I think it's time you learned your alphabet again. Honey, starting with the letter J, for justice." Amid the celebration, Bishop Crow pushed his way through the crowd. He stopped for a moment before Rowan and June. His face was a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. His power was broken, his public face shattered, but his malice remained. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous promise. "The last hand has yet to be played." He turned and stalked out of the church, a defeated tyrant walking away from the ruins of his empire, leaving the last ominous threat hanging in the air behind him. That night, the lights of Pike Hollow burned like a defiant constellation in the vast, dark bowl of the valley. A spirit of weary, hard-won celebration had taken hold of Garnet Bend, and it had made its way, by wagon and on foot, to Rowan's door. It wasn't a loud, raucous party. The people of this land were not given to such displays. It was a quiet pilgrimage of gratitude. They came bearing simple gifts, the currency of community. Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, brought a still warm apple pie, its crust a perfect, flaky brown. Old Man Hemlock, who owned the dry goods store, carried a slab of smoked beef jerky and a jug of his best cider. Even a few of the homesteaders whose faces Rowan had only ever seen in passing came, nodding their heads in a silent gesture of respect. Leaving a basket of late-season vegetables on the porch, they were celebrating the return of the water, the return of hope. Rowan, a man accustomed to the solitary company of his flock, found himself the quiet center of a room full of people. He was awkward, unused to the small talk and the press of bodies in his small cabin, but he bore it with a stoic grace. June moved through the small gathering with a natural ease he found himself marveling at. She spoke with the children who had tagged along, accepted the gifts with genuine warmth, and made sure everyone had a cup of cider. She had, in a few short weeks, become the heart of the community he had only ever guarded from its edges. Slowly, as the moon climbed higher, the visitors began to drift away, their quiet goodbyes and thanks echoing in the cool night air. Soon, the only sounds were the chirp of crickets and the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. The cabin, which had felt crowded just an hour before, now seemed to hold a profound and intimate quiet. The lingering scent of cinnamon from the pie mingled with the smell of wood smoke. They stood by the fire, the warmth a welcome comfort after the chill of the past few days. The events of the storm, the hearing, the victory, it all seemed to hang in the air between them, a story that was now a part of them. Rowan turned away from the fire and went to a small, locked chest that had belonged to his father. He opened it and took something out. When he turned back to June, he was holding a fountain pen. It was an old, elegant thing, its casing made of dark, polished wood, its nib and clip a tarnished silver. It was an object of quiet dignity, a relic from another world, another time. He held it out to her. "My father bought this in St. Louis, a long time ago," he said, his voice low and soft in the quiet room. "He never used it much, said his hands were too rough for such a delicate thing." June looked at the pen, then up at him, her eyes questioning. He wanted to keep a proper ranch ledger. Rowan continued, a rare, wistful smile touching his lips. But he always ended up using a charcoal stub on the back of a shingle. It was more his style. He pressed the pen into her hand. Her fingers closed around it. It felt cool and solid, weighted with history. "I want you to have it," he said, his gaze direct and full of a meaning that went far beyond the simple gift. "For you to write your name on this land." Tears sprang to June's eyes. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. The man in Santa Fe had wanted to own her, to make her an ornament. This man, this quiet, scarred shepherd, was giving her a tool to claim her own place, to write her own story into the very soil of the valley. She was not a visitor anymore. She was home. She couldn't speak. She simply nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She put the pen down carefully on the mantelpiece, as if it were a fragile treasure. When she turned back to him, the space between them had vanished. She stepped closer, into the circle of his warmth, and laid her cheek against the rough wool of his shirt, just over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat, a rhythm that was as constant and true as the turning of the seasons. She closed her eyes, and their breathing fell into the same rhythm, a quiet, shared cadence. He lifted a hand and gently stroked her hair, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. She tilted her head back, and he lowered his to meet hers. The kiss was not like the first one by the campfire, the hesitant, questioning touch in the dark. This was a kiss of homecoming. It was long and deep, a slow, unhurried exploration. It spoke of shared battles and silent understanding, of a loneliness that had finally found its end. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and his arms encircled her, pulling her so close she felt she might melt into him. His heavy coat, still damp from their ordeal, slipped from the back of the chair where it had been hanging and fell to the floor, forgotten. The world outside the cabin, with its dangers and its lingering threats, ceased to exist. There was only the warm, golden light of the fire, the solid strength of the man holding her, and the overwhelming feeling of having finally, after a lifetime of searching, found the one place she was meant to be. They broke apart, both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The firelight danced in his eyes, and she saw in their dark depths an emotion so profound, so vulnerable. It made her heart ache with a fierce, protective love. She remembered his words from the campfire, about the land teaching you not to hold on too tight. She knew now that he had been wrong. Some things were meant to be held, cherished, and fought for with everything you had. She lifted a hand to his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Touch me," she whispered, the words a soft prayer in the quiet room, a plea for the truth she now saw in his eyes. "Like you really mean it." His response was not a word, but an action, the last of his defenses. The final stone in the wall he had built around his heart crumbled into dust. He gathered her into his arms, his embrace not crushing, but absolute. It was a circle of strength, of safety, of certainty. He lowered his head until his brow rested against hers, a gesture of complete and total surrender. He held her as if he were memorizing the feel of her, as if he were sheltering her from all the storms the world could ever unleash. The fire in the hearth seemed to roar its approval, sending a cascade of bright embers up the chimney. His touch was not a question anymore. It was an answer. It was a vow. The cabin door, not fully latched, was nudged open by a sudden gust of wind, letting in a swirl of cold night air. But inside, in the golden circle of the firelight, there was only warmth. The shadows on the log wall behind them merged and became one, a single, intertwined silhouette dancing in the flickering light. It was the dogs that broke the spell. A sudden, frantic, violent barking erupted from outside, shattering the peace of the night. It was not their usual nightly chorus. This was a sound of alarm, of rage. Rowan's head snapped up, his body instantly tensing. He pulled away from her, his expression transformed in a heartbeat from tenderness to a sharp, feral alertness. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "What is it?" June whispered, her heart suddenly pounding with a new, cold fear. "Fire," he said, the single word. A curse. An unnatural orange glow was beginning to flicker against the dark outline of the sheep pen. The acrid smell of oil and burning wool began to snake its way into the cabin. Crow's parting words, "The last hand has yet to be played," slammed into her mind. This was it. This was his final, cowardly act of vengeance. Rowan was already pulling on his boots. Several of the men who had been at the celebration, homesteaders from nearby, had stayed to share a last cup of cider by the paddock. Rowan had known, instinctively, that the night was not yet safe. Now, shouts and sounds of running feet joined the barking of the dogs. He grabbed June's shoulders, his grip firm. "Stay in the house," he commanded, his voice the hard, sharp tone of a man taking charge of a battle. "Lock the door behind me." He was gone before she could answer, a shadow disappearing into the night. She ran to the door and watched as he and the other men grabbed buckets, horse blankets, anything they could find, and ran toward the spreading flames. The fire was catching quickly, licking up the dry wooden posts of the pen. The panicked bleats of the trapped sheep, a terrible, heart-wrenching sound. Lock the door. Stay inside. The words were meaningless to her. She was not the woman who had arrived in Garnet Bend a few weeks ago. She was not an ornament to be protected. She grabbed the largest water bucket she could find, her hands steady. She ran to the rain barrel, filled it with frigid water, and, her muscles straining under the weight, she joined the line of men fighting the fire. Her simple blue dress was soaked in moments, her hair plastered to her face. Smoke stung her eyes and choked her lungs, but she didn't falter. She worked with a grim, focused determination, taking her place in the bucket brigade, passing full buckets forward and empty buckets back. She saw Rowan, a silhouette against the roaring flames, his face black with soot, working with a desperate, controlled fury, tearing down burning sections of the fence to create a fire break. They fought the fire with the grim tenacity of people fighting for their lives, for their future, and slowly, painfully, they began to win. The roar of the flames subsided into a hiss and a crackle. The terrifying orange light began to recede, beaten back by water and will. Finally, the last of the flames were extinguished, leaving only a cloud of thick, acrid smoke and the glowing red eyes of embers in the darkness. The men stood, bent over, gasping for air, their faces grim in the moonlight. The sheep, their wool singed but their lives saved, huddled together in the far corner of the paddock. And in the sudden, eerie quiet, they all saw him. He was sitting on his white stallion on the ridge just beyond the fence line, a still and silent figure against the star-dusted sky. Bishop Crow had stayed to watch his handiwork. He had watched them fight, had watched them win. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Rowan straightened up, his chest heaving, his face a mask of soot and fury. He and Crow looked at each other across the smoldering ruins of the fence. June stood beside Rowan, her hand finding his, their fingers lacing together in a grip of iron. In that long, silent stare, everything was understood. The provocations, the legal battles, the cowardly acts of revenge, they were all finished. There was nothing left but the final, brutal truth of it. Tomorrow, in the light of day, it would end. One way or another, The sunrise over Garnet Bend was not a gentle thing. It was a verdict, light, sharp, and clean, sliced across the mesas, setting fire to the high ridges and chasing the last of the night's shadows from the wounded valley. It was the morning of the reckoning. By the time the sun had cleared the peaks, the church was full again. This was not a meeting of celebration or of fear, but of grim necessity. Judge Avery Stone stood at the front, his face etched with the gravity of the dawn. The town waited. They did not have to wait long. Bishop Crow arrived, not with a lawyer this time, but with the stark, stripped-down arrogance of a man who had lost everything but his pride. He was no longer a landowner or a tyrant. He was a cornered animal, and that made him more dangerous than ever. He ignored the judge, his burning gaze fixed on Rowan. "The law of words is for old men and women," Crow's voice boomed, a raw, ragged sound that was a mockery of its former confidence. "Out here, there is an older law, the law of men. I have been shamed. I demand satisfaction." A cold silence fell over the room. Everyone knew what he meant. "You are proposing a duel?" Judge Stone asked, his voice laced with ice. "In a town under my jurisdiction, I could have you jailed for even suggesting it." "What is there to jail me with?" Judge Crow sneered, gesturing to the flustered, useless form of Deputy Morrow. "This town has no law but what a man can enforce with his own two hands. I am invoking the code of the frontier. A fair fight, him and me." All eyes turned to Rowan. He stood beside June, his face unreadable. She felt a tremor of fear, a cold dread that was sharper than anything she had felt during the flood. This was the final, brutal logic of this land, a logic she had fought so hard to overcome. Rowan looked at Crow, at the raw hatred in his eyes. He knew that Crow's poison would never leave this valley as long as the man drew breath. A trial would take months. Witnesses could be bought or intimidated. Justice could be delayed until it withered on the vine. This had to end now. "I accept," Rowan said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the tense silence. June's hand flew to his arm, but he laid his other hand over hers, a silent reassurance. He then looked at Judge Stone. "But I have conditions," Rowan stated, his voice ringing with an authority that matched the judge's own. "This is not for pride. This is for peace. If I win, Bishop Crow leaves Garnet Bend and the surrounding territory. He forfeits any and all claims to land or water, and he will not return. Ever." He paused, his gaze hardening. "And he will pay, from the sale of his assets, for every fence, every bridge, and every home damaged by the flood he caused." Judge Stone looked from Rowan to Crow, a slow, appraising gaze. He saw the cold certainty in Rowan's eyes and the desperate, murderous gamble in Crow's. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the West. He understood that some disputes could not be settled with ink and paper alone. "A contract can be made with words as well as with guns," the judge declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You have both stated your terms in front of these witnesses. The town of Garnet Bend stands as witness to this agreement. It is binding. The matter will be settled, one way or another. Now." The entire town moved as one. A silent, solemn procession out of the church and down the muddy track toward Dry Willow Creek. The place of the duel was a wide gravel bar, scoured clean by the flood. A natural arena beside the now placid, sun-dappled water. The creek itself, the source of their struggle, would be the final witness. The townsfolk formed a wide, silent circle. June stood at the edge, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She clutched the fountain pen Rowan had given her, its smooth, cool wood, a strange and fragile anchor in a world that had suddenly dissolved into the brutal simplicity of a gunfight. It was a symbol of the future they had almost grasped, a future that now depended on the speed of a man's hand. Rowan and Crow faced each other in the center of the circle, the space between them charged with a lethal energy. Crow was smiling, a thin, ugly twist of his lips. He was in his element now, the world reduced to a simple equation of nerve and speed. Rowan's face was calm, his hands loose at his sides. He looked not at Crow, but at June, a long, deep look that said everything he had never been able to put into words. On my count, Judge Stone's voice was a flat, hard stone thrown into the silence. He raised a hand. The world seemed to stop. The only sound was the gentle murmur of the creek. The judge's hand chopped down. Crow moved like a striking snake. His hand was a blur, the gun clearing the holster in a single, fluid motion of black metal and death. The explosion of the shot was a physical blow, a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls. A collective scream went up from the crowd. June's world went white. Rowan's hat, the one he had worn every day of his life, was plucked from his head and sent spinning through the air, a ragged hole torn through its crown. He was still standing, unharmed, and his gun was still in its holster. For a single, eternal heartbeat, everyone waited for the second shot. They waited for Rowan to draw, to answer the fire, to end it. Crow was already cocking his pistol for the killing shot, his face a mask of triumphant fury. But Rowan didn't draw. In that split second, as his life hung by a thread, he made a choice. He would not become the man he was fighting. He would not answer death with death. He would not win by the code that had poisoned this valley. He moved, with a speed that was far more shocking than Crow's quick draw. He launched himself forward, closing the 20 feet between them in 3 powerful strides. He crashed into Crow with the force of a battering ram, a sound of splintering bone and expelled air. Crow's second shot went wild, plowing harmlessly into the gravel. The gun flew from Crow's hand as Rowan's fist connected with his wrist. They went down, a tangle of limbs on the hard, unforgiving ground. It was not a fight, it was a dismantling. Rowan, his face a mask of cold, controlled rage, systematically and efficiently took Crow apart. He did not beat him senseless. He simply subdued him, using his superior strength to pin him, to disarm him, to break not his bones, but his power. He wrenched Crow's arms behind his back, forcing him to his knees, and then onto his face in the dirt. He held him there, a knee pressed firmly into his back. It was over. The silence that fell was more profound than the gunshot had been. Rowan Pike had won. He had won without firing a shot. He had won by choosing honor over blood. Judge Stone walked into the center of the circle. "This contest is concluded," he announced, his voice ringing with finality. "By the terms of the binding agreement made before this town, Bishop Crow has lost. He will be escorted to the edge of the territory and is, from this moment, banished. His assets are forfeit to the town of Garnet Bend for the payment of his debts." In the aftermath, as Crow was hauled away, a broken and defeated man, a quiet figure stepped forward. It was Silk Danner. He stood before Judge Stone, his head bowed, his swagger gone, replaced by a shame that was plain to see. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I know I don't have a right to ask, but I've got nowhere else to go. I'll work. I'll help rebuild the bridge, repair the fences. I'll work for my keep." The judge looked over at June. It was her school that had been vandalized, her life that had been threatened. The decision was hers. June looked at the man who had terrified her students, who had been a symbol of Crow's thuggery. She saw not a monster, but a man who had made a bad choice, a man now adrift. "Anyone," she said, her voice clear and kind, "can learn to start again." A quiet murmur of approval went through the crowd. The fever of vengeance had broken, replaced by the cool hand of grace. Rowan pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the congratulations and the slaps on the back. He had eyes for only one person. He walked away from the center of the circle, away from his defeated enemy, and toward her. He stopped a few feet in front of her. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that held the weight of his entire life, he reached up and took off his stained, sweat-darkened leather riding gloves. The gloves he had worn every day, the calloused second skin that had protected him, that had defined him as a man who worked alone, who kept the world at a distance. He held them for a moment in his bare hands. Then, he bent down and placed them gently on the gravel of the creek bed, a final, silent offering. He was laying down his solitude. He was laying down his guard. He was laying down the past. He straightened up and stood before her, his hands bare, his heart open. June stepped forward, closing the final space between them. A slow, beautiful smile bloomed on her face, a smile that made her eyes shine with unshed tears of joy. She looked at his bare hands, then up into his eyes. She lifted her own hand, not to his face, but to his heart, pressing her palm against his chest. "Touch me like you really mean it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, echoing the words she had spoken by the fire. She gave him a radiant, teary smile. But every morning, and in the middle of a lesson, and surrounded by the sound of sheep and laughing children, he covered her hand with his own, his skin on her skin, the promise of a life, not of passion born of conflict, but of a deep and abiding love woven into the fabric of everyday life, passed between them. The sun climbed higher, and the water of Dry Willow Creek, the lifeblood of their town, ran clear and bright, glittering with golden light. A cheer went up, and the children, their fear forgotten, broke from the crowd and ran to the water's edge, splashing and laughing, their voices the purest sound in the world. From the direction of the town, they could hear the sound of a hammer on wood. Mabel Key was already hanging a new, freshly painted sign, "Garnet Bend School Open Daily." Rowan took June's hand, their fingers lacing together. A perfect fit. They turned and began to walk back toward Pike Hollow, back toward their home. Their two long shadows stretched out before them on the damp, renewed earth. Two separate figures merged into one, their story forever written on the face of the West. A story not of blood and dust, but of water, of light, and of a simple, unbreakable promise. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Let us know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like. And if you enjoyed it, consider hitting that hype button to help us share these tales with more people.